Welcome to the center of the universe and the home of the 18-time Grey Cup champion Toronto Argonauts. This is the X's and Argos podcast with Ben Grant and JB.
Welcome to the X's and Argos podcast, brought to you by Something in the Water Brewing. Ben Grant, joined as always by JB, and we've sort of scrapped our plans for today because there was big news in Argos land. We were going to talk about training camp coming up, rookie mini camp, but I think what all Argos fans want to hear about right now is the news that Chad Kelly has been handed, at minimum, a 9-game suspension by the CFL. We'll go through that and some of the details and what it means for the club and what their options are. All that and more is coming up on this episode of the X's and Argos podcast. Before we get into things, JB, I want to tell you a little bit about Liberty's Farm to Glass Pilsner, which I've got on the go beside me here. This is a fantastic Pilsner, and in true Something in the Water Brewing style, it's got a local flavor to it, a story to it. There's always a detail. They say drink curious, and I love that about Something in the Water. This one got my attention just from the description alone, because the idea behind it is that it's a recipe that will taste different depending on where your beer is brewed. And in this case, it's Southern Ontario. And so they went to get malt from Mississippi Mills in Pakenham, Ontario. They went to get their hops from Tavistock hops in Perth. And they, of course, have their own house lager yeast that they use. And so you combine those things together and you've got an Ontario taste, an Ontario flavor for your Pilsner. And so just like all their beer, there's something interesting about it. And this one's no different. And this one can be picked up in the LCBO as well. But why not check them out in Liberty Village? Something in the Water Brewing. They're steps away from where the Argos practice, steps away from BMO Field. If you haven't been there yet, you've got to check them out. JB, 9-game suspension. Let's break this down a little bit. And maybe before I get you involved, I want to just read a couple of things that the CFL put out on their website. Commissioner Randy Ambrosie making a statement as well. And then I also want to read out the statement that the Toronto Argonauts put out following that. So the CFL suspending Chad Kelly for 9 games. And this is in addition to, I guess, potential games if conditions aren't adhered to. He also has to attend mandatory counseling sessions conducted by a gender-based violence expert. And what Commissioner Ambrosie had to say about this is as follows, and this is all a quote from him. Players are the ambassadors of our great game. They are expected to be leaders in the locker room and role models in the community. It was important that we performed our due diligence to properly review this matter from all points of view. That in-depth investigation found that Mr. Kelly unequivocally violated the CFL's gender-based violence policy. Mr. Kelly's suspension is the direct result of his behavior. The addition of mandatory counseling focuses on his need for self-reflection and understanding of his actions. He must take full advantage of this opportunity for personal betterment in order to return to the CFL. And on the heels of that, I just want to read you what the Toronto Argonauts put out. And this was through David Morisuti, who tweeted this out earlier today. Today, the Toronto Argonauts were informed of the outcome of the league's investigation of quarterback Chad Kelly for violations of the CFL's gender-based violence policy. The club will respectfully abide by the league's decision. The Toronto Argonauts and MLSE share the CFL's commitment to providing healthy and positive work environments. All right, initial reflections, JB, when you see that, you see the suspension handed down, you see what Commissioner Ambrosie had to say, you see how the Argonauts responded to it. What hits you initially?
I think the length of it is the one that's kind of the most shocking. A minimum of 9 is very strongly worded. I mean, it's not the indefinite that Sean Lemon got for being caught gambling, but it's a very strong signal from the league. They clearly in their investigation found things that they were very troubled with, and felt confident that these were punishable, and came down heavy. I don't think there's any other way to read it other than they don't need to wait for a court decision or have to go down that road. They are an independent league, and they can make their own decision based on their own investigation. So I think it speaks to probably the evidence that was received was disturbing, and the league, I think, rightfully came down very heavy. I think, especially in football, but hopefully in all businesses, all professional sports, in terms of the sanctity of the workspace and the work environment being safe for everyone. I'm torn. I mean, obviously, it's a huge problem as an Argo fan, but also, I fully support, bringing down that level of punishment if deserved.
Yeah, and I totally get that. It's because it is a long, like you said, it's a long suspension for in terms of like on-field suspensions. I think 4 still stands as the longest suspension for on-field actions. For off-field, we've seen suspensions get quite severe, although not there's not that many of them, but there are some that have gone on for longer than that. You can go back to Johnny Manziel, of course, as well. You can look at Chris Edwards' suspension. And this stands out certainly. 9 games is a long suspension. I think what makes this one a little different, and why I think there's probably going to be frustration from both people who feel that this is too long a suspension and people who feel this is not long enough suspension. Because I guarantee, just based on what I've seen on social media and conversations I had, you're going to get both sides of that. And I think why that may be difficult for some people is that with on-field suspensions, you can see what happened. And while there may not ever be a consensus, because those get pretty dicey too. Like, people don't always agree with on-field suspensions. That people always say, well, no, that's too many, that's not enough. You look at like Garrett Marino, for example, that suspension where you take a quarterback out for a season. What's the appropriate suspension for that? Again, I don't know, but I think what makes it easier is that you can see the act. You have the evidence. It's there in front of you on your TV screen. You see it replayed 100 times. You can look at that, and for yourself, you can judge. You can say, okay, I feel like based on what I saw, I think this level of suspension is appropriate. And with the Chad Kelly suspension, I can't help but feel very in the dark here, and I don't really know what to think. Should it have been more? Should it have been less? I don't feel like I have enough information. I trust that and I applaud the CFL for doing an independent investigation. They went through it, and they clearly felt that they had enough evidence to impose a very serious suspension. But they were very vague in their findings, and I think that leaves us kind of wanting just a little bit more. But I guess just how it is, we're not going to get that. It's partly probably because there's an ongoing civil suit, and the league doesn't normally go into detail on stuff like this that happen off the field. And so we are left a little bit in the dark on that. But I think you just have to, just like the Argos said in their statement, you have to respect the decision. You have to go along with what the decision is and go forward from there. And so I guess that's where we now turn our attention as two guys who cover the Toronto Argonauts. The Argos now have a pretty gigantic hole in their roster right now, and we're looking forward for 9 games, potentially more, I suppose. Where do you start now in terms of the quarterback position for the Argos?
Well, I mean, it depends what your plan is. Look, this is a business, and the Argos may, MLSE and the Argos may decide to go in a different direction than Chad Kelly. So I think you have a plan where Chad is, simply not part of the Argos moving forward, and you rebuild from there. And then there's the plan where, you believe that Chad will participate, fully in the rehabilitation and going to therapy and being a positive, productive member of the CFL community. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know which way they go. But I would bet that is in fact a conversation, because, this is not strike one in Chad Kelly's life. This is something we talked about, prior to this year, and then prior to that. So do they want to make a long-term investment? I think that'll really come down to conversations that they have with Chad. But I would, I don't say I would bet, um, but I would not be surprised if it is a consideration right now that they simply move on from Chad Kelly.
Oh, I think they absolutely have to consider it. I think it's irresponsible not to do so as a business, as a football club. I think you have to weigh all options, certainly. But I think let's take a look at all of the options in front of us. So you first mentioned the idea of, well, do the Argos move on from Chad Kelly? Well, so first of all, you've got to look at contract structure and what that's going to mean, because they signed a 3-year extension with Chad Kelly to make him the highest paid player in the CFL. And so you have to look at that for one. And how does that potentially handcuff you? How does that factor in? Most CFL contracts, the way they're worked out, you can generally, with most of them, there's an option to get out of them after a year. It depends on how it's structured, what's built in financially. And so, that's something that they have to look at. But I think you've got a little bit of time here too, where a decision doesn't necessarily need to be made right away in terms of Chad Kelly's future with the Argos. And yet, depending on what your approach is going to be, you have to have routes that you can take at the end of this. And so let's go with what you said first and say, okay, well, let's suppose the Argos did decide, you know what, we're going to move on entirely. We're going to go in a different direction. Well, we know that there are going to be some options for them, because financially things do start to open up. So if that's the route they decided to go, and even with the suspension dollars don't count against the cap. So in theory, there would be some money there for the Argos to be able to spend. But quarterbacks aren't easy to find. Like, look at half the teams around the league. So it's very easy to say, okay, move in a different direction, even if you believe that that's the best thing for the organization. What direction that is a really tough question to answer, because half the teams in the league don't have that direction. They don't have a quarterback that they necessarily feel good about. And they're looking, trust me, they're looking. There just aren't a lot of great quarterbacks out there. So that's certainly problem number one. You have to have a solution. You have to have an idea in mind. If they decide they're going to bring somebody in, bring a big splash of some sort in, whether that's through trade or perhaps bringing in a name, a known quantity, maybe a former NFL quarterback or something like that. If you're bringing them in, then you kind of have to have a plan for, well, what's going to happen down the road if they're not going to be moving on from Chad Kelly? What happens after 9 games? Where do we go from there? So these are all factors they have to consider. Let's look at trade possibilities. Let's look at, if the Argos decided to make a move now, instead of going with Cameron Dukes, Bryan Scott, let's say they decided to make a move. Again, you can't just go into that without knowing what your long-term plans are. But truthfully, I think they have to kind of wait this out a little bit, just to see how Chad responds to all of this, how he responds to the news of the suspension, how he responds to the suspension itself, and how he responds to the counseling sessions that are mandated as part of this suspension. And if he responds positively from that, and if he returns to the field, and that's another part too, he's got to come back to the field and resume the play that we saw for the entire regular season last year. Are you going to get back the same Chad Kelly? So there are a lot of those questions that need to be answered as well. But I think from an Argos standpoint, they probably have to wait and see how some of this develops. And their plan is really going to be about, what do we do over the next 9 weeks?
Yeah, I mean, you also have you also have I mean, I think there are a couple things at work here. I mean, number one, I think probably most importantly is that you have a new sheriff in town for MLSE. And so Keith Pelly is now moving into being in charge of MLSE, although the Argos have always kind of been a minor, partner in that MLSE family. Be very interesting to see where Keith Pelly comes down on this right at the beginning of his reign, as being sort of the head honcho of it all. So I think that's a factor that would be very different if he were not there. in terms of what he wants as his, organizational, mandate moving forward, and where does Chad fit into that? And then how is Chad able to reconnect with the fans? Obviously, the CFL found enough evidence to warrant this level of suspension, and so sexual harassment and things along those lines are a problem, especially you're trying to have him be the face of your team. It's a different animal when it's quarterback, and just different rules, different responsibilities, bigger checks than if, say, you were, a right tackle or a free safety. So how is he able to recuperate his relationship with the fans? I agree with you. Those are really complicated. Those are really complicated situations, and I would assume he probably has a meeting coming up very shortly with Keith Pelly. I expect a move from the Argos sooner than later. I think if they are going to stick with Chad, then they will do that. And if they're going to move away from him, I would assume they will move away from him in the next 3 days.
Yeah, something's a decision has to be made, and maybe internally a decision has already been made. We don't know, but they have to. The season's starting, like everything's getting going soon, so there's not time to just kind of wait around and do nothing. Something has to occur. So let's talk about some of these options then. So let's look at let's look at the Cam Dukes Bryan Scott option first. So suppose the Argos decide, you know what, we've got Chad Kelly. We're hoping things go well. We have faith. We've talked to him. We feel like this is going to go well, and that he'll come back from this better and ready to go as a football player as well, and that he will be able to reconnect with the fans and his teammates. Not to mention also, and we're going to go with Cameron Dukes and Bryan Scott in the meantime. What does that Toronto Argonauts team look like with Cameron Dukes at the helm? Well, we got a chance to see it a little bit last year. Cameron Dukes played some really good football. He put up some good stats. I think his touchdown to interception ratio is maybe a little bit misleading. He played conservatively at times. That was sort of part of the design of that. But these were meaningful games for other teams. They wasn't necessarily meaningful for Toronto, having already clinched the East, but they were for other teams. And so you had Cameron Dukes not playing with an entire complement of weapons. He didn't have his full arsenal of receivers and backs and O-linemen out there every game because the Argos were rotating rest for all their players. So even under those conditions, Dukes looked pretty good. How does he fare? How do the Argos do if that's the direction they go? They decide, you know what, we're gonna go to war with what we have with Cameron Dukes and Bryan Scott.
Yeah, look, I was a convert. I was not a big fan of those two guys as the backup quarterbacks. I didn't feel they had the experience that the team needed. But I can't deny that watching Dukes, he was efficient. He was accurate. The players seemed to really respond to him. Now, we both know it is a very different animal between being the guy who comes in and the guy that people are game planning for, which is why, twos and threes are twos and threes. So what will that look like when teams drill down on Duke's weaknesses? I think I think that's where you get it's pumpkin time. I wonder for Dukes, is he able to overcome that? Like, I wouldn't say I saw anything that made me feel confident that he could be a starting quarterback in the CFL. I agree. I thought he looked fine. But I don't know. I can't say that I would be confident if Dukes was running the team. I would think that would be hard. Also, the first half of the schedule is challenging. Like, it's a tough first half of the schedule. I think if you did that, you're hoping for, if you could get away with 4-5, and you bring Chad back in, and you feel like you can make a push in the East. I would think you would be pretty optimistic to hope for much more than that Um, I don't think the defense is going to be as dominant as it was last year. You know, you have changes in players, changes in coaches. I think it's going to be very, and just generally, you know, defenses are very fluctuating in terms of, it's very hard to be a defense statistically that's that great every year. You just catch breaks. So I expect the defense to take a little step back statistically. Um, and you know, you have a new running back that you're breaking in. Look, I think there are a lot of things adding up to some question marks. You know, I don't think it's an ideal scenario moving forward if that's where you go.
Toronto Argonaut fans were spoiled a little bit last year with that 16-2 record, that phenomenal regular season that the Toronto Argonauts had. I think that you have to throw dreams of that out the window right now. I think you would have had to anyway, because that's not something we can't think along those lines. But I think if you're thinking about those first 9 games with Cameron Dukes, I don't think you're thinking we got to go 7-2, we got to go 6-3. I think you just have to keep your head above water. I think if that's the plan they go with, they go with Dukes and Scott. They know when Chad Kelly's coming back. They have faith he'll do so. I think what you're looking to come out of that 9 games with is a record around 500. I think that's got to be the plan, because I think this team's strong enough where if you did go with Dukes for the entire season, I think this is a playoff team. I think it's just barely a playoff team. I think they're fighting right until the last couple games of the season. But I do think there's enough talent on this team, even without the league's reigning MOP. I think they have enough to make the playoffs. And so in that 9-week stretch, we can take a look at what those games are. You're right. It's not an easy start, but I think they have enough to go 4-5, 5-4, somewhere around there. And I think that probably is enough that if Chad is the Chad we're familiar with, comes back at that point, he can lead them into a playoff run. But let's take a look at those. For those who haven't looked at the schedule yet, there's no week 1 bye this year, which I know Argos fans are very much relieved by. But you start it with 3 straight home games and then 3 straight road games, so it's not a normal schedule per se. So they host BC, they host Edmonton, they host Montreal. That 3-game homestand, you're looking to go 2-1 out of that homestand, and I think that's definitely a possibility. I think you say to yourself, we have to beat Edmonton, and that won't be easy. McLeod Bethel Thompson coming back to BMO Field, that's not gonna be an automatic win like it might have been over the last few seasons. BC, I don't think is going to be as good as they were last year, so that's certainly a possibility. And I still don't know what Montreal is. I didn't know what Montreal was last year. I'm still a little bit shocked they won the Grey Cup, but so I don't know what we'll get out of that game either. I think it's good for the Argos that it's not Montreal, but yeah, that's very much a stretch that I could see them coming out of 2-1, 1-2. I'd be pretty stunned if they couldn't win any of those first 3 home games, and if that were the case, they'd certainly be in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, the schedule, you know, doesn't line up really optimally for them. I think you have to get one of those 3 wins at home. You know, you have 2 against Calgary, 1 against Winnipeg, you know, 1 at Saskatchewan. It's a tough schedule. I think if you're looking to get the 4 wins, if you're looking to get the 4 wins, I think you probably have to win 2 of those 3.
Because the rest of that schedule, once they hit the road, it's at Saskatchewan, at Montreal, at Hamilton, and then you come back home to host Winnipeg, which won't be easy. And then that 9th game, you travel to Calgary, and traveling to Calgary is always death for the Argos, no matter what that Calgary team looks like. I don't know what it is about that place.
We have both Calgary games right in the suspension.
No, I don't think so. No, it's only the one. It's just the one Calgary game in the suspension, isn't it? Oh no, you're right. Yeah,
no, because they have a bye week too.
It's back to back against Calgary, and then it's after week 10 that
then there's a bye week.
And that's where Chad could come back in theory. So the good news about that is that Calgary at home, I don't think is the same as Calgary on the road. I think those are two you're in different universes. But to get Chad back going into a bye, I think does benefit the Argos, because now you've got 2 weeks of practice that he can be a part of, having served those 9 games, and then you go into the second half of the season. Not on a short week or anything like that, but in fact the opposite, where you've got 2 weeks of practice. So that, I think, actually does work out all right for the Argos. So that's the Cameron Dukes, Bryan Scott answer. If that's what you're doing, it's dicey, but you can get there. And we've seen too, like, they don't have to be 4-5, 5-4. Like we've seen teams get hot down the stretch. We saw Montreal do that last year, where they got to mid-September and then decided never to lose again. But they certainly didn't look like much going into that stretch. So teams do that. It's not like they're dead if they aren't 4-5, 5-4 at that point. Let's look at the other options. So one of the first things I read as soon as the suspension came down, people started talking about Nathan Rourke, and I said right away on that, like, that's not happening. Nathan Rourke he's not coming back to the CFL this year. And of course, you just told me a few minutes ago, Nathan Rourke ended up signing with the New York Giants. Was he claimed on waivers? Did he sign a contract?
Yeah, he was claimed on waivers, and like we talked about, he's still, even though I was really disappointed that New England, bailed on him, he's still so young. He has at least 2 or 3 more years of bouncing around the league.
Yeah, even if things don't go well, that's what I say too.
Yeah, right. Like, worst case scenario, he is going to be invited to camps for at least 2 more years.
Yeah, if he had not been claimed on waivers, even if he had not signed a contract, if I were advising him, I would have told him, just wait, because there are going to be injuries. There are going to be teams that aren't happy with what they see with the quarterbacks they've got. And remember, he was... sorry, go on.
No, the Giants have a nice landing spot. I mean, I know Tommy DeVito kind of became an internet hit, but I mean, that is not a quarterback locked up franchise.
The thing for him is he needs to stay in one place for a long time. This isn't a Nathan Rourke episode. This is for another time probably. But yeah, I think all CFL fans believe if he had stayed in Jacksonville and gotten an opportunity, that might have been really positive for him, because he had time to learn that system. He knew that by the time
I don't know what happened there.
Counted.
He definitely, I think I bet you when it all comes out, if it does come out, like, I bet you he got screwed in Jacksonville. Like, when he signed there, he was sought after, and it just made no sense that he wasn't the two.
Well, that's what happens when coordinators and QB coaches come in and they bring guys with them from past teams, and that happened to him again in New England. And so here he is again. They signed him,
and then New England brought in like 9 quarterbacks, and like, well, I guess that's not going to work out in New England. Yeah, I thought in Jacksonville it was a perfect location for him, and and they brought in like such, just no ceiling veteran guys that are like, why is this your backup quarterback? To what end? Like, we already know who this person is. Like, why are you not taking a shot at developing another quarterback? Well, I mean, that's your Jacksonville Jaguars for you, perennial Super Bowl champion Jacksonville Jaguars.
So the long and the short of it is Nathan Rourke is not coming to the Argos. He's not coming back to the CFL. That's not a thing. And so what is a realistic possibility if you decide to go in another direction? You're not going with Cameron Dukes and Bryan Scott. So trade options: Jeremiah Masoli, Trey Ford, MBT. That'd be an interesting thing. Let's look at the possibilities there. So Jeremiah Masoli, I don't see that as a thing. I'm not sure he's going to be 100% healthy. I don't think he's going to be ready to go to start the season. I haven't actually heard anything on that, so I could be wrong. But just again, the nature of that injury and when it happened, I can't think that that's something you would go into with any kind of confidence. I would dismiss that, I think, right away, unless... Well, people obviously know more than I do about this, but from what I know, I just don't see that as an option. MBT and Trey Ford, those are interesting, both in very different ways. MBT, you're talking about short term. Obviously, he'd be really easy to bring in the sense that he knows the offense, he knows the coaching staff. He has won here. He's been great here, and so that makes sense. But I just don't think you do that if you're Edmonton. Edmonton clearly didn't want to go with Trey Ford as their quarterback. They had the option to. They didn't have to bring in MBT, and everything that they've said since signing him seemed to be like, yeah, that's our guy. We're going to go with him, and Trey Ford is going to learn under MBT. And so, to me, I just don't see any way. Like you would have to offer the world for MBT. I think as the Toronto Argonauts, Trey Ford less so. I think that's a player that maybe is a little bit more accessible. He doesn't have the experience. He doesn't have the track record of leading a team to a Grey Cup championship. Obviously, you're coming from very different places, but he's an exciting Canadian quarterback, and you're not gonna, and also like we know how this works. Like whatever Trey Ford's price was yesterday, that is not the same price today because the demand just changed a little bit. So I don't know what the Argos would have to give up to get someone like Trey Ford, or if that's even a direction they'd want to go in. But that's really it. If you're bringing in someone that you think, well, this is going to be our guy until we sort things out, I really just think it's those guys. I don't think there are other options there. Is there anything you like in those options?
No, I don't think they make a trade unless they're cutting Chad, to be honest. I think if they don't cut Chad, then they roll with Dukes. I think if they cut Chad, then they look to make a trade and then I think there's a decent chance that they take a shot at Mazzoli if they're going to go move forward and then see what they can find in the off season. That would be my guess at a plan, is that you would sign Mazzoli, roll the dice for a year, and then try and find yourself somebody who you can build into the next quarterback if that's the decision you make. But I don't think they will, because like you say, there just is not much there. It just doesn't make any sense to give any assets up for these these quarterbacks. There just is not. There's not much there. There's not much there in the NFL. You look at guys who are sort of on the edges of the NFL. I don't think any of them are coming to Toronto, nor would you want them to.
Well, because it's not an immediate thing anyway. We know that. Even good NFL quarterbacks, guys with promise, they come here. It doesn't mean that they will be successful in the CFL. In fact, that it rarely means you'll be successful in the CFL.
I agree. Like the NFL has, for whatever reason, continued to show an anti-CFL bias and just refuse to, hopefully, I mean, knock on wood, Stiggers has a great season, but it just seems really hard to break through that barrier. They just do not look to the CFL for talent, and it hurts the CFL a little bit. If the NFL was a little more open to guys coming, I think it would really be a boon to the CFL. They just don't seem to be able to get past that idea of the CFL.
And that extends, like you're saying, like to the players that are, when they're weighing their options, you're trying to bring someone up here that's maybe on the cusp, just needs to show something in playing time. They're not maybe seeing, well, that will be an opportunity that will jumpstart me and someone will pick me up. So yeah, I don't know if it's going to be, I don't know if you're going to be able to lure somebody here that would be worth luring here. And I just don't see that as an option either. And I don't even think the Jeremiah Masoli thing, I know you were higher on that than maybe the other options. I'm not. I think that's probably option 3 based on the options that I outlined. But it would depend on what you're giving up. Like what would that cost you? And I'm sure you have to have those conversations. I'm sure they've already happened, or if they haven't, they'll be happening over the next couple of days. I think you have to do your due diligence, call around to every other team and just sort of say, hey, what even if you're looking for a backup to these, even if you're looking to fill out your QB room, because that's another thing you have to do. I think you got to call around and say, what would you want for this guy, this guy, this guy? You have to start exploring. But I think just in terms of where they go from here, like we've said, and kind of what we started off with, I think what will end up making the most sense is probably going to war with what they have, probably going with Cam Dukes and Bryan Scott, and then seeing how that goes. And if it's a complete failure, then you can make a move. You can make a switch at that point, maybe. But I just think it's going to be tough. And like I said, I just don't think MBT's an option. I don't think Masoli makes sense if he's not ready to go. And I think Trey Ford is going to be more expensive than he was yesterday. And that's generally not a deal you want to make if you're paying more than you feel somebody's worth. But that may mean we're heading into the season with Cam Dukes and Bryan Scott. And the good news is training camp's about to start. Those guys would be getting probably a lot of reps anyway, and preseason time.
Preseason just became incredibly important.
Yeah, it did because you now and the good thing timing wise, like better this happen now than mid-season or something like that where there's no time to prep. Here you've got now the whole preseason, you can focus it, and Coach Dinwiddie knows what's in front of him. He's like, okay, I've got 9 games and I've got to get these guys ready for it. And so they're going to get all of the reps, they're going to get all of the preseason time so that they can hit the ground running. And both of those quarterbacks have an entire year of experience under their belt too. The negative side of that, which we didn't really address, is defensive coordinators have film on Dukes and they've had time to plan something. We'll see how defenses respond to what kind of play he brings to the table. So those are all interesting things. And in terms of selling training camp, training camp's an easy sell for me anyway. But yeah, I know the quarterback position was not a position of interest coming into this for me. It wasn't something I thought we'd have to look at a lot. And suddenly here we are where that is going to be the primary focus in training camp is how did the quarterbacks look today? And Coach Dinwiddie is going to be asked that every single day, you can be sure. Well, that will just about do it for us on this episode of the X's and Argos podcast. Minicamp starts this week. Rookie minicamp starts this week. We've got training camp on its heels, cut down days, and then preseason games before you know it. It's all coming up really fast. Make sure you keep it tuned to the X's and Argos podcast. We'll give you everything you need to know, and we'll have an extended version of preseason next week. All the stuff we were going to talk about today will hit next week. Plus, we'll have more to update that with as the camps start to get underway. For JB, this is Ben Grant saying so long, and may all your pre-snap reads be good ones. I'll see ya.
Go, Toronto Argos, go, go, go. Pull together, fight the foe.